Hi, Chapel here, and this is a guide for using melee weapons in any difficulty in Gunfire. There's going to be 3 different builds covered in this video, so if there are any in particular you want to see, feel free to use the timestamps below. All the characters can use melee weapons to varied degrees, but all the builds in this video play the bird, so why is this? Melee weapons can deal high damage with the trade-off of having to position dangerously. Bird has some of the highest defensive capabilities in the game, and unlike Turtle, is able to keep a weapon out the entire time. He also has some of the best mobility and on-demand iframes with his leap. Overall, this results in him being the most consistent by far. Before anything else, here is some advice on how to survive in melee. To make use of Bird's defensive tools, you need to understand your limits and get used to managing your armor. In the early game, you should be careful of when you use your leap cooldown. Try to save it for regenerating armor or dodging attacks unless you are confident that you will survive after jumping in. Unless you have scrolls that handle defense, lowering the cooldown of your leap is one of the main priorities for all melee builds on the Bird. In the late game, leap should be low enough cooldown so that you can spam it for constant damage and defense. First, let's talk about the combustion build. Now this build is the most standard melee build, which maximizes weapon damage with the help of elements. All 3 swords have an incredibly high elemental chance by default, and using an elemental shared Gemini complements the weapon perfectly. The combustion fusion is the most important, so pick a secondary weapon that will give you corrosive plus fire. Unfortunately for Flowing Light, this is harder to achieve since it's a lightning weapon. To get the third element, try to prioritize the scrolls Realm of Corrosion, Blazing Hoop, or Thorny Carapace if you see them. As for ascensions in this build, it's best to find a balance between damage, leap cooldown, and armor regen. Armor break ascensions with all or nothing are a great way to do this, as they give a balance of stats and give your builds plenty of ways to scale. Secondly, let's talk about the Cleave build. Out of the 3, this is the least consistent by far, since scaling Cleave damage into late game sacrifices a lot of much needed defensive ascensions. This build is much stronger in lower difficulties, but in Reincarnation 8 it can still be powerful with some good RNG. The best way to start off this build in Reincarnation is to get the Bladed Cleave Blessing at the beginning of the run, which gives a large buff from the get-go and massively increases its scaling into late game. To help scale further, any kind of skill damage scroll is a lot more valuable here than anywhere else, so try your best to pick up those, but also make sure to grab defensive scrolls too if you need them. When using Cleave, Flowing Light or Fire Tower are the best options for weapons typically in this build, since their attack animation combos smoothly into Cleave when timed correctly. It's also possible to use Cleave while reloading, so do this to maximize DPS. Finally, to talk about the Ascensions. The most important part by far is to get easy kill as early as possible, to start last hitting enemies for increased Cleave damage. After this, 1 point in Cleave Carnival is great if you do not have alternative ways to sustain secondary skills. Thirdly, you want to prioritize 3 points in Fierce Wings, which gives a huge boost in damage to both your cleaves and your weapon. Once you have these, just take ascensions that are best for covering your weaknesses, whether that be damage or defense. The final build I want to talk about is Melee Icy Spores, which uses the Spores Gemini. I talked about this in one of my recent videos, but it also works incredibly well in melee builds. Just a warning, this build requires a lot of weapon swapping and is one of the hardest to play in the game. However, the upside is, it needs very little damage scaling, which allows you to spec very heavily into defense and still be able to kill enemies. The damage does fall off a bit late game, but until then it's one of the fastest builds for killing elites and bosses. To make up for this damage fall off, it can be good to have a way to apply both lightning and corrosive for miasma in the late game, as it can deal with a really annoying enemy such as UFOs, which can be a nightmare to deal with. So to do damage, the idea is to place an Icy Spear beneath the enemy, then swap to the melee weapon to proc spores after every swing, whilst the enemy is stood in the spear. The Flowing Light works especially well here, as its weapon skill allows it to hit multiple times in quick succession for huge bursts of damage. To increase your spore damage further, upgrade your melee weapon as much as possible, as the spores scale with the base damage of the weapon and nothing else. As for ascensions, feel free to go as much defense as possible. This is easily achieved with 3 points in Gigantic Explosion, and either 2 in Steel Armor, or 3 in Iron Scud. With these, it's near impossible to die so long as you are using your leap off cooldown. To close it out, here's a quick summary of the strengths and weaknesses of each one. I hope you enjoyed the video and found it helpful. Feel free to sub if you'd like to see more Gunfire content, and have a great day. I'll see you.